Hello, everyone. Hope that you are well. Where I am in space and time is Wednesday, the second week of May. It's pretty early-ish in the day, so I am trying to finish up this semester. The class that I was taking just ended last week, and grades for the college where I work at are due on Friday, so I've been grading all morning. I thought I would take a break though and spend some time with you and show you my perspective on how to write a philosophy paper, especially if you are an undergrad in college, maybe like upper division classes, but it could apply to freshman and sophomore years as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just going to go ahead and screen share. See if I can do this. Okay. There we go. All right. So, yeah, so there's my MLA heading. And then we had prompts. You didn't have to basically follow the prompt. If you didn't want to, you could make up your own, I guess, argument, an area that you wanted to talk about, but I just followed the prompts. So this one was, how would deconstruction or postmodernism respond to post-truth claims? And I tried to answer it. So I always divided my papers up into an introduction. So basically, if you have a prompt, if you don't have a prompt, you can give yourself a prompt. You can give yourself a research question to answer. That way you can narrow your topic, and your thesis statement is basically an answer to the research question. So this is kind of what I teach in Comp 1 and Comp 2 as well. But philosophy papers are a little bit different than just your composition classical argument essay. But we do start with an introduction. The introduction in a philosophy paper, as I understand it, sort of deconstructs the question itself, explains what you think the question means, or, you know, even if you're giving yourself your own question and creating your own question, what are you trying to ask? Defining your terms, defining your, not necessarily your standpoint, but yeah, but your terms. What does that question mean to you? And so you can sort of see how long that is. I also, and I'll go through the actual paper as well. So if you're just interested in knowing what I wrote about, then you can skip ahead. I have underlined my thesis statement for you. I think it's always good to give signposts to your professors, because honestly, you don't know how much time your professor is going to spend grading your paper, reading your paper. So they want to probably read it as efficiently as possible. So if they can see, okay, they definitely have an intro, they definitely have a conclusion, this is how they organize their papers, this is where their thesis is, or where they think their thesis is, then that just helps them along. So you don't have to underline your thesis, but I do. So my thesis for this paper was, postmodernist writers use postmodern/deconstructive methods. So I'm kind of equating those two. I know it's an argument whether you can equate them or not, or whether they overlap like a Venn diagram, but I'm discussing both of them. To pathologize aspects of postmodern phenomenon. So that's going to be my first argument. How do they pathologize aspects of postmodern phenomenon? So it's kind of a paradox in a way, because postmodern writers, like if you think about, do I have it? Okay, it's over there. Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, which I'll talk about that title because that was one of the texts that I spoke about in this essay. The title is The Postmodern Condition. So if you're saying something is a condition, that makes it sound like it's an illness to me, that there's something wrong, that that it needs a solution. If it's a condition, it's kind of a grave way of putting it. So I'm going to look at rhetoric that kind of fits into that. And okay, so what I was going to say is that one of the things I realized reading and discussing postmodernism in my class is that it's not always clear if the postmodernist writer is endorsing. I don't think we can always assume that they are endorsing the postmodern condition, which might be discussed as, disorderly, being against meta-narratives, being against or being suspicious of order and hierarchy and authority and power, and wanting to question sort of everything and stay in this realm or this space where we're not really landing anywhere, at least for very long. So we're kind of maintaining instability. So I think that postmodernist writers and thinkers both play around with the potentials of that kind of space, but also critique it, and their writings are cautionary against how it has affected our mental health as individuals, as societies, and aspects of the post-industrial age that perpetuate what is problematic in the postmodern era, if we can say that we live in a postmodern era. So a lot of postmodernists like to deconstruct the term itself. So they're kind of on both sides. They're critiquing some aspects, and they're kind of indulging and playing with some aspects. Deconstructionism is particularly it's particularly apt to call deconstructionism a postmodern method. But at the same time, they're not wholly endorsing. And I'm going to argue in this paper that they actually are nostalgic for the pre-modern. I find this in Byung-Chul Han. I found this in Baudrillard, which I'm going to have a video about. I guess I think I even found it in Lyotard. I find it in, although Heidegger would be writing in the modern era, he's been kind of aligned with existentialism. He's been aligned with a precursor to postmodernism, kind of like Nietzsche has. He has a nostalgia for the pre-modern. So that's who I can think of right now. So I think it's a really complicated kind of positionality that insituatedness of postmodern writers put themselves in and create for themselves. I know that people like Jordan Peterson have connected postmodernism with Marxism, and that has some validity because postmodernists do sort of use the neoliberal regime, fetishized capitalism, commodification of everything as one of the culprits, along with how we use technology, especially for smart phones and technology. So, and a lot of postmodernists, you can see in their backgrounds that they had stronger alignments with Marxism when they were younger, and now they don't feel as if they have to or later in life, and their later writings, and I realize that's like an incredible generalization, but just seems to me that's my impression of the very small sort of grouping that I've read. It seems like it would be valid to say that they were affectionate toward Marxism at one point, but their connection to Marxism is somewhat loose. In the sense that, especially when you think about Marx and his sort of linear trajectory that we can put in conversation with Hegel, kind of looking at, and I say linear, but I know that there's a dialectic, a going back and forth, but there's a clear vision. And even though postmoderns have, I would argue that they do know what they don't want. They don't necessarily define what they do want apart from a hearkening back to the pre-modern. And when I say the pre-modern, I look at a time of the symbolic, of ritual, of cycles, of even being embedded in nature, and a lessening of, well, I guess looking at the sacred, like Baudrillard talks about charm a lot. We've lost the charm, or people will say we've lost the soul, or, Heidegger can be very, I'm not going to put Heidegger in this. We didn't even talk about Heidegger in my class, but I just can't help but seeing echoes of Heidegger's nostalgia and his response and approach to technology. I can't help seeing those echoes in the postmodernist writers and thinkers that I've read. I'm leaving Foucault out of it because I feel like Foucault and Butler, some of the postmodernists, I guess this can't apply to all of them, that nostalgia. I'm not sure I've seen that nostalgia like in Judith Butler. But Baudrillard, Lyotard, Byung-Chul Han, for sure. So I don't know. So maybe I need to think about like groupings of postmodern thinkers. So anyway, you see that in my thesis statement, I am giving a preview to how I'm going to organize my paper. The first, sort of, I would say, like keyword solid kind of idea is pathologizing aspects, such as less transparent structures of dominance and the consequences of an advanced capitalism without submitting to a modern nostalgia for grand narratives. Actually, I need to read that again, sorry, because I didn't even follow that. Postmodernist writers use postmodern deconstructivist methods to pathologize aspects of postmodern phenomenon. And so I'm defining what the postmodern is here. Less transparent structures of dominance and the consequences of an advanced capitalism. So that's kind of what they're critiquing, without submitting to a modern nostalgia for grand narratives, although they do have a vision for the future inspired by the pre-modern. So that last part is really my second argument. So I have my conclusion, you can kind of, or my introduction, you can kind of see how long it is, and I'm going to read through that so you'll see exactly what I put. But again, it's just clarifying your question, saying what the question means to you, and then making sure your thesis is at the end. Then I have a summary, because in a philosophy paper, you are probably going to draw from a conversation that's out there, or particular philosophers or texts of philosophers. So you want to summarize basically the ideas that you are going to deconstruct and analyze, and maybe give examples and branch out to your own perspective and your own arguments. So you want to make sure that the summary does not start arguing and does not start interpreting. A lot of times when I'm writing my summary that comes after the intro, so I think in, like, let's say in a Comp 1 or 2 class, you would have somewhat of a summary in your introduction. You wouldn't have a separate paragraph, but this is something that's unique about the philosophy paper from my experience, how I wrote my papers. You have this second paragraph that's supposed to be the summary. And again, it's just a paragraph because our papers were 5 to 7 pages. So a lot of times when I'm reading my summary, what I was going to say is I realize I catch myself kind of making an argument. And so I often, as I'm writing, I'll often at the end, when I read it over, cut and paste and take some take some of it out and put it in the conclusion. Sometimes I don't realize that I'm writing the conclusion at the same time as the summary. So I don't know if that makes sense, but just make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to in the particular section that you are, writing. So I like to put my subheadings. You should probably ask your professor if they mind that or not. As a professor, I love subheadings, and my professor didn't mind it. Yes. So that was a summary. So basically I mentioned Lyotard and Baudrillard because those were the two writers that I was going to talk about. And then I have my first argument. So I just had 2 arguments. You can have 3 arguments if you want to, but my argument 1, I'm focusing on disease, dis-ease. So trying to deconstruct that Lyotard, the title of Lyotard's book, basically, and then Baudrillard really fleshes out. I think Lyotard in the postmodern condition, he sort of critiques what's going on and deconstructs it for us. And he mainly says in that book, I'll just give you a bit of a summary, he critiques how basically fetishized capitalism, advanced commodification, the totalization of commodification has affected and changed the status and the roles of science and the university, mainly looking at knowledge. So he argues that we should be suspicious of the power structures that are behind the movement of different areas in life. So he talks about funding concerning science, and he talks about profit and what research can be done and what research can't be done. He talks about the changing of the university away from knowledge for the sake of itself toward a more efficient, productive in terms of material production, majors and pursuits. So thinking about what is valued and what is not valued. It's not valued for spiritual sense and intellectual sense, for cultural sense. It's whatever is going to create profit, whatever kind of knowledge is going to create profit for businesses is going to be valued. So Baudrillard really looks at, so it's somewhat dystopian in a sense, yeah. And Baudrillard, I think, has a little more fun playing with this possibility or this disruption of knowledge, but I do not think that he completely endorses it. And I think he's also dystopian because he is the one to say that certain tendencies are a cancer, or it's an allergy, or it's melancholy. We're all melancholic. So I'll go over that paragraph. But basically, I just thought, you always want to see what sticks out to you in a paper. If you can look at your readings through a particular lens, like for instance, I am going to be writing a paper, or even you can think of it as a chapter of a book that I'm envisioning. And I'm going to be looking for, I think when you're starting to write a book or you're starting to write a longer paper that you're submitting to an actual publication, so beyond the college classroom, you really want to think about even more about themes. So if I had the theme of, let's say I was doing a phenomenology of love, or a phenomenology of solitude or something like that, I would be looking at the places in various texts where, I could extract something that would maybe comment on the phenomenon I'm trying to discuss. And and so the sacred and the pathological kind of called forth my attention. So anyway, the second argument, I called it Postmodern Visions Forward and New Metaphysics, because it's not necessarily that it's anti-materialist, because I think you can kind of see how our current technological age is both material and, a commodified age is both very materialist, but also abstract and non-material, because if you think about the virtual world, and then when you go back to the pre-modern, which is, so that's kind of in postmodern literature, we're kind of critiquing those two extremes, I would think, or those two poles, thinking about the historical chronology of human beings. When you think about the pre-modern, it is anti-materialistic in a sense that it's not so controlled by profit. That's not necessarily, and power, although, of course, when you think about conquest and colonization and things like that. But if you think about the day-to-day and the yearly cycles and the practices of a community that's somewhat stable and not being threatened by maybe outside regions or nations, etc., communities, cultures, then it is focusing on the spiritual. It's focusing on what's sacred, what's esoteric, what's mysterious. There are rules around the sacred and mystery. For instance, what you are not supposed to write down because it's so valued and it's so dangerous, in a sense, if it gets into the wrong hands, that even if we can write it down, like thinking about the Druids and Celtic times. Oh man, why do I have an eyelash? Okay, just a minute. I have to pause this. Can I pause it? Okay, I don't know if I just paused it or not. Okay, I'll be right back. Here on YouTube, you might have to say it. Okay, I'm back. I hope I'm still recording. Let's see, okay. It's like, how do I tell if I'm still recording? Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, where did oh my goodness. Now I feel like I really am in a classroom because technology is, okay. I'm not doing well at technology. Okay, there we go. It was just at another place. All right, hold on. I'm going to save this, call it part. Oh my goodness. Okay, call it part 1. And just 1 second. I don't know if I can go ahead and it's processing. Okay, we'll just hope that that records on my Spotify podcast. All right. What was I saying? Okay, so right. Druids, Celtic culture, the spiritual, but it's also quite materialistic, just in a different way. It's embedded, and so it's both transcendent, but it's also focusing on eminence, because you are taking care of the earth. You are working with the earth for your sustenance. You're outside. You are directed by the very material conditions of your environment and the seasons concerning like when you can harvest and when you can plant. And so, you know, so we see both, but we see both in different versions, if that makes sense. But I'm focusing on metaphysics. I think that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to justify my use of metaphysics. Because there's something that the postmodernist writers, I feel, want to extract from these materialistic, mythological, religious conditions of the pre-modern. And that something is the essence that we need to manifest, you know, in the near future, in our own particular way, because you can't really go back to the past. And I don't think they are wanting us to imitate, because, you know, Baudrillard mentions like the violence of the past, and I don't think he's wanting to bring back like sacrifice or anything. So I think it's kind of metaphysical. So anyway, I didn't get bad critiques or feedback from my professor. So I'm going to say that I can just continue trying to dwell and reflect on whether I'm using metaphysics correctly. So anyway, so this is all about that. And then the next, so you have introduction, you have summary, you have your arguments 1, 2, and maybe 3. And then you need to have a counter argument. And my counter argument just against so I was trying to clarify misunderstandings of the postmodernists, because a lot of people think, I think that postmodern writers embrace postmodernism, and they don't necessarily do that, at least not all of them. When you start to read them, they're actually critiquing it and, you know, telling us to watch out for what's going on. But what I wanted to write my counter argument about was the dystopia and sort of the fear mongering, or the potential for readers to feel as if postmodernists are being kind of apocalyptic, and if that's really necessary and that's really healthy, or if it's actually, because remember my prompt, the prompt is, how does it respond to post-truth claims? Is it sort of adding to the issues and the problematics of post-truth? And I guess when I say post-truth, I kind of harken back to Baudrillard and the simulacra, where there's what is at stake is no longer whether something is true or false. We've kind of gone beyond that and are engaged with what he would call the hyper-real, but you might think of like we care about entertainment more, being entertained. If you think about where the political debates, how they are set up now, is it really set up as a discourse to kind of figure things out and leave with questions as well as answers? Or is it, you know, a theater, a spectacle? And do we care about that? Do we care that the news might be limited by the powers that be to maybe say certain things and avoid saying other things? And so what they're saying is true, but it's not like the whole truth, etc. So that's what, you know, we kind of mean when we say post-truth. So anyway, so here is the counter argument, and I'm addressing those, and then you have your conclusion and you have your references. So I used footnotes here. So I kind of did a mix of MLA and I think like Turabi and Chicago. So, and then I love, as a professor, and so I do this when I'm a student, a little note to the professor. It's kind of like a reflection. So your professor kind of knows, because your professor is kind of in the dark when they receive your paper, right? They don't necessarily know how much effort you really put forth how sincere you were. I mean, effort kind of means like your time and how much work you put into it, how you feel about it, like on the scale or the continuum of like being super sure and certain. You know, sometimes it's nice to show a little humility if it's sincere, or, you know, if it's for your benefit if you say something like, I felt really strong about this part of my paper, but this other part of my paper, there are ideas that I'm still not quite sure of and I don't feel grounded with, and I need to read more in this area. It's good if you just kind of like share that with your professor, I think. Of course, every professor is different. But that kind of helps me understand, because then I don't think, oh, they think this is just the perfect paper, but I need to show them where they have some flaws in logic, etc. So if you kind of help me know, if I'm the professor, if you kind of help me know where you are and what you think, and give me just a little reflection, then that also helps me grade your paper and helps give feedback. And I'm saying me, but like professors, I'm supposed to be a student here. I forget my positionality. I'm both. So that's just what I do. So it's always good to kind of check and say, you know, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is what I think I'm supposed to do. Can you look at my paper just really quick and tell me if I'm on the right track with what you want concerning structure and etc. You know, so you can always double check. Like our professor had us, and obviously I'm just like showing you who it is, but you know, whatever, it's fine. Our professor had us submit for just like a few points, a rough draft or an outline or whatever we wanted to submit the week before our paper was due. And I think that's good just all around for professors to do, and good for students, because as a student, it made me start maybe earlier than I might have, which was going to benefit me, because then I had more time to think about my ideas and read over my ideas, and also gives your professor an opportunity to give you feedback if they are, you know, going to do that. So, okay, so I'm going to just start reading my paper. Again, the prompt was, how would deconstruction of postmodernism respond to post-truth claims? So I'm reading my paper to you both so you can get an idea of the philosophy paper and how it flows. Not that this is an example of like the best paper ever, but I thought for me it was, you know, I tried, and it was, I felt better about it than I did maybe like my second paper, because I was just more sure about, you know, I wasn't BSing. I was sincere about, these are my real thoughts, you know? And so sometimes, sorry, 1 second. So I can never like just sit down and have nothing happen. Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully I finished whatever I was saying. Okay, and the other reason is I just think that I have ideas that might benefit you if you are not super familiar with postmodernism, or if you have questions about it. And if you are interested in Lyotard and Baudrillard, or if you don't know them, now you will know that they are good representatives of the postmodern sort of era. And yeah, so I think it's also like we can just talk about it as a text. All right, postmodernism is a method of suspicion. Instead of trusting order, institutions, authority, and traditions, everything must be questioned due to the agendas of power that are at their source. A postmodernist critique deconstructs terms, concepts, and/or practices to reveal construction and genealogy in what seems natural or is taken for granted, basically, by others. I wonder if I should write that. I just never stop granted. by others. I just never stop editing. Judith Butler, in her essay Contingent Foundations, argues that to deconstruct is not to negate or to dismiss, but to call into question. While some might argue that postmodern critique has ushered us into a post-truth era with its persistent questioning, so this is what I feel like why I'm writing my paper. Butler reminds us that with any kind of productive critique, the goal is not deconstruction. Nihilism or indifference might be a possible endpoint for some, and this is postmodernists are critiqued for leading us into, or just critique in general is sometimes critiqued itself for leading us into, well, we can never, how can we ever be stable if we're always questioning our terms, if we're always seeing the other side or the nuance and how complicated it is? How can we ever land or rest? Will we just give up because it's so exhausting? Chaos and order are in a dialectic with each other, which is what Nietzsche talks about in The Birth of Tragedy, which I'm reading right now, and I talk a little bit about in my video, my May book haul. So if you haven't watched that video and you're interested in knowing a little bit about that, you can watch it. But is anything problematic about the selective focus on power and profit that is found in postmodernist critiques by Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, Stuart Hall, Joan Wallach-Scott, Jean Baudrillard, Jean-François Lyotard, and others? So these are some of the people that we wrote. And I think it's always a good idea to, if your professor especially wants you to write an essay about what you've read in class, even if you're focusing on one philosopher or one or two texts, it's good to maybe draw some of the other voices in. So that was one feedback, piece of feedback that I got. So I started doing that. So I not only want to clarify and, in a sense, defend postmodernism from being too in alignment with the post-truth era, I also want to critique it. So I'm saying that postmodernist critiques might have a problematic focus on power and profit that makes us all, suspicious. And so, kind of like conspiracy theorists, I guess. Perhaps, so I say yes, maybe, if it becomes another grand narrative that lacks nuance. If they are kind of creating this grand narrative about how everything, science, the university, etc., is just pushed on and dismantled by power and profit, isn't that just, how do we know that that's not just another grand narrative? And the postmodernists are supposed to not like grand narratives. So I don't know, just raising that as a problem, I guess. Postmodernist critique points toward an alternative, subversive truth, an identifiable truth. Using texts from Lyotard and Baudrillard, I propose to show that deconstructionist postmodern critique aims to dismantle the reader's belief in one truth in order to point to another. So again, that's responding to the prompt in my introduction, because I'm saying that it's not post-truth. It's still endorsing a particular type of truth. It's just an alternative truth to, what's out there. Suggesting that truth remains important outside of modernist sensibility. Postmodernist writers use postmodern deconstructive methods to pathologize aspects of modern, and I already read my thesis. So here is my summary, and I might just stop after this because I think you kind of get the gist of the paper. So this is how I'm summarizing. It is a misconception that postmodern philosophers endorse all or any postmodern practices and perspectives. So I'm kind of reiterating that a little bit, including the current post-truth era. The title, for instance, of Lyotard's famous postmodern text, so I'm starting to summarize, looking at the title is a part of describing or summarizing a text. The postmodern condition, a report on knowledge. Naming postmodernism a condition connotes that postmodernism is a disease or an illness to be diagnosed. That readers need a report on knowledge. So see, I'm like deconstructing the, I mean, this is what you should do even in like Comp 1 and Comp 2. Or any literature class, you're deconstructing the quote that you're using to explain, to get more out of it. And that's your contribution. That readers need a report on knowledge implies that awareness must be directed to what has been surreptitiously going on. Something untoward has become of knowledge. Lyotard writes, the question, overt or implied, now asked by the professionalist, student, the state, or institutions of higher education, elsewhere Lyotard includes science itself, is no longer is it true, but what use is it? So this quote is basically addressing post-truth and critiquing it, because I think we can assume that Lyotard would judge this as not being ideal. Performativity, functionality, and efficiency have taken the place of truth, no longer valued for itself. So this is basically Lyotard's book. Why? According to Lyotard and Baudrillard, power and profit. Lyotard writes, scientists, technicians, and instruments are purchased not to find truth, but to augment power. Everything is accelerated and atomized in order to be commodified, and this direction of attention and production has detrimental effects on the majority of humanity who are caught up in the path, which Baudrillard attempts to provide an overview in his work, Simulacra and Simulation, with this pathologizing of our current state and metaphysical vision for the future. And then I move on, and I would say that in my first argument, I'm shifting my focus to mainly Baudrillard. And also in my second argument, I'm shifting it in a great deal to Baudrillard. So if I would have any critique of my paper, I would say I don't really give a fair balance in terms of space and attention to Baudrillard in my summary, and I'm quite Baudrillard heavy in my argument 1 and 2. So I don't know, and so see, this is, if I were grading this paper, like if I were, it's just like a student paper, that would probably be my comment on this. But I would say I guess I just didn't have time, and I didn't, like, in all honesty, sometimes it just has to be good enough, because otherwise you're gonna have to ask for an extension. And so I felt it was good enough. But I just want you to know, I realize that I don't really talk about Baudrillard except in the last sentence. And then I don't really have good examples from Lyotard in the argument. So I don't know, not perfect, but that's, but that's what it is. So yeah, so I hope that helped. If you are thinking about going into philosophy, or you are maybe in one of my classes, maybe I will assign this to my students. If I teach a philosophy class in the fall, to know kind of how to write one. Anyway, I thought I just thought it would be fun to also share. So if you want to read my entire paper, you can always email me, and I am happy to share it with you. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go back to grading because it's now after 12. And I hope that you all have a great rest of the day. And for those of you having summer vacation, let me know what you're doing.